welcome. Let me quickly reintroduce myself with a last name. Thank you, Tim, for not saying my last name, because usually people just get it wrong. So my name is Natalia Tepluhina, and I'm a Vue.js core team member. I care mostly about Vue documentation, but I also like to talk about some random things. I work as a staff front-end engineer at GitLab, and we work with Vue on our front-end, which gives me a lot of food to talk about random things on Vue. And I'm a Google developer expert, which is absolutely unrelated to this talk. As Tim already mentioned, I moved to Amsterdam. So this event is very special for me, because 2 previous Vue Amsterdam conferences, I've been flying here like all the cool kids for 3 hours. And today, instead of that, I was commuting from Centraal by bus 48. Like, cheers to everyone who did the same. By the way, it was the most JavaScript bus in my life. So, previous talks. Last talk I made was in 2020. And you won't believe, but it has this name. You might not need Vuex. I didn't realize how right I was. Also in this talk, I mentioned Pinia. And I did it before Eduardo gave a talk about Pinia on the big stage. I'm quite good at predictions. But generally speaking, the talk was ranting about state management. 2.5 years after, I'm still not done. So today's talk is going to be a little rant about global state. What is global state in a nutshell? It's just some data that you need in many places in your application. And if we look at Pinia with some very simple state, it's nice. You just define some state, you have a little counter, you use it in 5 places in your application, whoever does this, everything's cool. You're going to update the counter, you add an action, much better than Vuex, because you would probably write an action and mutation. And it's simple, it's understandable, it's cool. However, we're dealing with very specific kind of local state here. It's synchronous. The operation doesn't involve any async logic. It's non-persistent, which means our counter only exists on the client side. We're not dealing with the server. It has one source of changes. I only change my state with this increment, and that's it. And it does not create a lot of boilerplate. It's very efficient code in Pinia. But real-life applications don't work like this. We use server data. So let's start building a little app that involves some server data and see what challenges do we have with the local state. And we will be using this application that features a list of tractors. You might ask me, why tractors? Well, I'm born and raised in Ukraine, and I developed quite a love for tractors over the last 3 months. So there will be tractors. And you can see that here we have 2 places where we need data about tractors. The main list on the home page and the counter. 2 places. OK, let's involve the global state in this. We would also want another view. So whenever I click on the tractor, I have a single view, and the counter is here. So I have 2 components where I need to fetch data. You can say, why 2? You can fetch on like application root. I don't want to, because maybe I have a designer that thinks about disabling the counter. So on this page, I wouldn't need the list. I don't want to fetch it on the root level. I don't want to fetch it in the navbar only, or only on the home. So let's just decide 2 places, API call. Simple. Let's just create a global state with tractors property, fetch it, and show it. So we start with our tractors property, and it's already a bit more complicated because we need to handle loading and errors. You do handle your errors, right? I hope so. And we write simple asynchronous fetch using Axios. So we just get in things with get tractors that is abstracted to our API layer, and we have a catch. Awesome. Now let's fetch tractors in 2 components, right? So I add this code to both navbar and main component. I know that you know that it's wrong, but let's just pretend it's going on. Well, obviously, I have 2 API calls now. because I'm fetching here and there instead of the root level. I'm not calling it unmounted, so we're developers. Let's deduplicate this. We create this very hacky getter that checks if tractors are already in the local state or if we're maybe just fetching. So if we're in the process of loading, fetch started. Also finished, but OK. And if fetch is not started, we fetch our tractors. OK, deduplicated. Amazing. Code is looking good. Now, I also want to add a single tractor view. And I want that this data would be also cached to my local state. My main list looks like this. I only need ID, name, and image URL for the main page. But for the details page, I need a bit more data. I need an engine, rated power, and some description. And what I want to do is, whenever I'm fetching the tractor, I want to enhance this object in my list. Just make it bigger. So, OK. Sounds easy. Let's fetch the tractor and just add 3 properties to that certain object in our array. Well, this is already a bit bloated, so I'm fetching the tractor, and I assume that there is some data in my local state. So I go over my array and find in the tractor if it exists. If it exists, I add 3 properties to it. If it doesn't, I just push the tractor to the array. Also, I need to account on the fact that I can go to a single tractor by a deep link and then go to the main page. I don't want to lose my data about the single tractor too. So this was fetched tractors previously. Now I need to also account on tractor data. And it grows. Now I'm checking if there are tractors in our local state, and if it's there, I'm just adding it to the certain object. If it's not, so lots of reduce and find and everything. Now we're OK? Now it should be good. No. I go to the page of a single tractor. I go to the main page. This very lonely tractor in the field. Why? You remember this hacky getter that I got? It checked the length of tractors array. But we already have a single tractor. OK, let's hack it. It's more than one. It works. Now we're good, but we get a bunch of problems with this approach. First one, I think I've seen it a million times. How to write a getter that also fetches data if data is not in the Vuex. It was I don't know, all over the forums. How to keep my data up to date? Our cool approach is not that cool, because if I have my page with tractors open for 3 days, and I just switch between tractor and tractor's view, my data will be stale. I'm never refetching. If tractors are in the Vuex, we don't do a refetch. So how to deal with a server? People add WebSockets, server-side events, polling, every 30 seconds, just fetching data from the server, just in case. A bunch of different solutions, none of them are perfect. What if 2 components start fetching simultaneously? What if 5 components start fetching simultaneously? How to handle a proper deduplication of the logic? Because we're dealing here with a synchronous state, and this is already enough because we are writing JavaScript. This is already a pain. Our state persisted remotely. We don't control it. It's on the server. It has a shared ownership. I can imagine someone just editing my tractors on the server while I'm speaking just now. Not really, but it can happen. So not all states are born equal. There is a very clear distinction between synchronous and asynchronous states, between data that are just local and should be local state, and between the data that you fetch from the server and you want to deal with the server when you change them. Global state is separated. As for the second part of the server cache, a few years ago, I enjoyed a lot the library that was also featured in the You Might Not Need Vuex talk, which is the Polo client. So if you are happy front-enders that work with GraphQL, you can use a Polo client, and it does everything for you. It caches your data. It handles loading state and error state. It does query deduplication perfectly. And it's super cool in general, but lots of magic. and some switching paradigm. The problem is, it works with GraphQL. You can make it work with REST. Don't get me wrong again. You can write Apollo resolvers on the client, but it will be no better than just writing everything in Pinia. The boilerplate for local resolvers, type defs, type policies in new Apollo is quite a lot. You can also handle local state with Apollo, but again, we are doing this and it's a pain. So what if you're using REST? But if you don't want to write all this stuff in Vuex and every single time having this issue with a single tractor? In React world, they found the solution for this. It was called React Query. It was quite hyped on React, and I have no idea why we're not speaking about this at Vue conferences, because we have Vue Query, which is basically a wrapper around React Query, and it solves most of the things I've been showing you on tractors. So let's start live coding, because I believe it's best explained when shown on the screen. We have our tractor application that is absolutely empty for now, and we're going to populate it with data. Now, those on the last rows, is the code visible? OK, if it's not, just yell. Let's start with fetching tractors. So instead of having an empty array here, let's write that we want some data from the server, lst tractors, and I use query. Use query is just a composable exposed by Vue Query library. What do we need to use it? First, we need to specify the key under which the tractors will be stored in our cache. I just go with tractors. Very intuitive. You can use a string here, but it's common practice to have the key wrapped as array. You will see why in the next query, but for now, just remember it. And the second argument is getTractors. If you wonder what getTractors is, there is no magic. This is just an Axios call to my local server. OK, now we have tractors. It's exposed to our application. It won't work. And let's see why. Let's go to our Vue DevTools and check our home. Refresh the page. Oh, it's still undefined. This is the best. Okay, let's get it here. I didn't expect to fail so early. I expected to fail, but a bit like with the flow of the application. I also do this. Let's just restart it and hope like it will work for us. OK, Git server. Vue DevTools. Oh, connection refused. Now my server decided to die. Running. Yes, it was the server. Like, always blame backend. If something happens, like, it's not me. Now we don't have tractors yet, because you can see that we're fetching from the REST API, and what we stored as tractors is actually the whole bunch of data. So data, status, and all the things. We only need data. So let's extract it. And in Vue Query for this, you have lots of options. We will start with select. Like, you probably expected me to write computed. No, not going to do this. I will just extract what I want with res data. This is a simple getter that takes what we want from the array of tractors. And we have some tractors, and my slow internet just continues getting pictures of them. So the first quest is done. We fetch the tractors. Now let's also work with loading and error state, as every responsible front-end engineer. So I remove these fake ones. And it doesn't add much to our code. I'm just having isError and isLoading right from the Vue Query. Let's go and test how this works. So first of all, I change to fast 3G. Let it load for a second. You see, there was a little moment of loading spinner, so loading works. Now, what about an error? Let's make the API fail again. And there is some, even a restart, there is some long fetching, and you see bunch of network errors at the bottom. Why? By default, Vue Query will refetch 3 times, try to refetch 3 times, and then fail. So if it was just a single hiccup on your server, it's quite handy. But for this application, don't really want to refetch 3 times. So let's just add one more option here, saying retry 1. You can set it to false or 0. It will be not that many retries, so here we go. One more interesting thing about that, let me just change it back to normal API, is you see it fetching again. I'm changing the focus of the window, fetch, and fetch again. Again, by default, Vue Query comes with refetching on window focus, because it considers that user switched out of this tab, maybe for a while, so whenever we come back, we want new, fresh data coming from the server. For the purpose of this demo, I don't really need it, so I'm going to just disable refetch on window focus. And we have code that reliably fetches everything just for one component. Let's abstract this to Vue composable and reuse it in the navbar to see if it works properly with the deduplication and all the cool things. So I'm just copy-pasting this. Oops. No, I'm just copy-pasting this. Let's create a little composable here. So something like composables.js. And we will export function use tractors. Use tractors, they are cool. For tractors, please. And what we want to have here is basically our code from home component. We just move imports out of it and fix the link to the API. And of course, we need to return everything from the composable. So tractors is loading and is error. And in my component, instead, this bunch of the code that I have, and the ref too, I just expose my data from the composable. Tractors is error, is loading, use tractors. OK, everything is fine, and now we just simply copy-paste this to our navbar and remove our placeholder tractors. And you think everything is working fine. We have our counter 8, but it's not. Whenever you refresh the page, you have empty, everything is broken, and you wonder why. Because in our tractor navbar component, we check tractor's length. But when we're fetching tractors, it's undefined. That's why the application is failing. So we need some kind of initial data to have here, and we can do it with placeholder. Placeholder data is basically the initial value the query starts with, an empty array instead of undefined. So you're still not OK. Oh, yeah, because I put an array here. This is not completely correct because I need to match the structure of the data that I have in response. And I have an object with data array. So data is empty. Now we have proper tractors. Everything is cool, but for now, we only built expensive REST API client on top of Axios. Our data are not cached. We're just fetching them. How to check this? Let's go to this unexistent tractor page, back, fetch. Fetch again. So how do we enable the cache magic? How do we keep our tractors in Vue Query cache. One more property, probably the most important one if you're using React or Vue Query library. It's called stale time. Stale time is the interval of time while client considers your data being OK. So for 10 seconds, my client's OK, this is fine. We're keeping this data. We're using them. After 10 seconds, the data is spoiled. We just want new tractors. This interval, like you can vary it. You can use it for 5 minutes, for whatever you want. And again, this is probably the most important property you need to remember about when using Vue Query. Now, when I go to the page, see, tractors are in the cache for 10 seconds. After this, if I do the same operation, they are refetched. Now let's see if it's as simple to write this query for a single tractor. It will be a bit more complex, but again, nothing super fancy. So it's navbar, let's go here. And instead of having these two properties, let's quickly add a tractor query. So again, data tractor is loading, use query. Again, an array where the first key is still tractors, because we are working with the same entity, with the same list of tractors. But we also need to specify what exact entity we are working with. So we have an ID equal to props ID. This comes from the router. And there is a second argument. Whenever you need to pass a parameter in Vue Query to your fetching function, you need to use a callback. So we go with get tractor props ID. OK. And we need to add our select, because again, it will be data. So select res data. Okay. And now we have a single tractor. Pay attention that this one is not cached. I'm only caching the main query for now. If I want to cache everything, I can also define stale time, like here, on the client level, whenever I create the client instance. So for now, for all the queries, stale time is 5 seconds. For main query, it's overridden by 10 seconds. So tractors, tractor. OK, this works. Loading works, like whatever. What if I want to change my list of tractors? What if I want to modify it? It's doable. So let's add some new, Cyrillic, const new tractor. Just some object with ID 11 and name, I don't know, Vue Amsterdam tractor, because why not? Now we are going to use a different composable called use mutation. So when you fetch data in Vue Query, it's query. When you change them, it's mutation. I think it was inspired by Apollo client, because the API is very similar. I'm not sure about that, it's just a theory. It exposes a method mutate that I need to call when adding the entity to my backend. And I'm using the mutation. And here I just use my callback. And this will be add tractor, and I'm passing new tractor to it. And of course, I need to call it somehow from my template. So there will be a button called add tractor. And we call mutate on click. Let's check our network tab when doing this. And you see there was an API call. It was successful. We added the tractor on our backend. It doesn't appear here. If I refresh the page, it's here. I mean, without a picture, but still. But you need to tell the query either to refetch, like we invalidate the cache and say, okay, fetch tractors again, or to update the cache somehow. I prefer the second option. I always prefer that with Apollo client too, because why I'm making the second query, backend will be unhappy. So let's just modify the cache. Mutation like query has an object of properties, and we can use onSuccess. So whenever mutation is fine, and we have some response. We want to add some data to the query. To do so, we will also need a client instance exposed, because we will be overriding query data with the client. And this has a hook used use query client. So on my response, I want to say client set query data. And here we need this key. Here becomes the moment when, OK, we need our tractors. So we want tractors to be updated. And we need to tell it what data we need to write. This will be an array of our existing tractors, value, because it's ref. I failed like 10 times when rehearsing this. Like every single time I forget about value and like, everything is broken. And we have a new tractor returned by the mutation as a response. So res data. OK. Let's see if we failed. We did. Why? Oh, because I'm adding the same tractor. You see 500 error. Blame backend again. Because it could provide some more readable thing when we have the duplicate of the ID. So I provide a different ID here. Fine. Let's see if it works now. And just refreshing just in case. It doesn't work again. Now it's interesting because it should work. OK, src undefined. It doesn't even add it. Oh, and it appeared. Like, I just refreshed the page, and it worked. So this is a very simple example of using Vue Query. It has a bunch of different properties. You can set up polling. You can prefetch data. You can set indefinite queries. You can do so many things. And I think it's a good example of inspiration to at least try it and see if it matches your application. So it was a nice talk. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions about Vue Query, Vue, documentation, GitLab, traumatic experience of commuting from Central by bus 48, please find me during the lunch break, and let's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia.